A lot of anything you can paint black is what we started on. But,
So what was your first evolution of a bike? What would you get? What was your first one?
the first bike I got actually was a 1977 Vista Clodhopper. And it was Vista is part of Bicycle Corporation of America. It's, a lot of distributors carry these bikes, but I actually still have the frame. It cracked and I kept it and I've repaired it and I've rebuilt it with all the original parts. But you're talking like 105 gauge spokes, ACS hubs with Ashtabula. This is first gen production bikes. And so that was I worked my ass off to buy that bike, and I probably talked the bike shop guy into doing payments or something. But,
Right.
moved from there to what I was told was a CYC Stormer, which wasn't. It was some kind of import. It had the CYC stickers on it, to a G-Boy. And then I got a co-sponsor with Torker, and things started sorting out. But, yeah.
CYC. So I always loved the CYCs, dude. Oh,
Yeah.
I thought they had the geometry right for the time. A lot of bikes, but I'd love to talk to somebody from the 70s sometime about the evolution of geometry with the seat tubes and the head tubes from the 70s to the 80s. But yeah, I always liked the CYC Stormers. The guy that my neighbor had not a DG, but Dan Gurney Eagle. And oh my gosh, I was so jealous of this guy. He sucked, but he had the best bike out of all of us, dude. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Is it always like that? Like the worst guys on the bike have the best bikes?
So you just spurred my memory, because Dan Gurney, I think, was Mongoose, just like the Blue Maxes and those others, right? If I'm correct. But now you're reminding me, the first time I really got excited about BMX was I saw, a Mongoose Moto Mag, pearl red, or no, the candy red, it was just sitting in a bowling alley. And, I just remember looking at that thing, and I was riding my Vista, and I'm like, oh my God, like it just took this whole step. They weren't any light or anything, but I mean, oh my God, you're like, as a kid, you're like, I got to have that. How do I get
Right.
one of those?
Yeah. I thought that I thought I listened to an interview with Mike Devitt. I thought that he said that he imported Dan Gurney's. I thought he said he interviewed. Was it Dan Gurney?
I may be wrong on the Gurney. I'm thinking, what was it? There were three brands under that. Oh, the Jimmy Weiner.
Jimmy Weiner.
Yeah,
I don't like those bikes, dude.
Yeah,
they're squash, dude. The Weiners, don't you think?
Yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I just listed off all those early bikes I had. The geometry in every one of them sucked. Even when I got my first Torker, I was on the wrong bike. So like this thing was supposed to be a CYC, but what I found out later was a Miata with some production bike. It was way too long. I've got a picture of him. Like, the thing's just a truck, And I'm like, how did I even go fast on this? Of course, you put a Pro Neck on it, and you put some aluminum bars and a fluted post, and you think you're cool, and you think you're going fast. The bike, then I got that G-Boy. That was the same way, man. The geometry was just compacted, just like Race Inks, and for that matter, early PKs. The geometry, because those were all made at Race Inc. So they're all the same geometry. They're practically out of the same jig,
I always thought that the G-Boy and the FMFs and the Race Incorporateds, the seat tube was way too far back.
Yeah, and the front end was short, and the head angle was like 73 degrees or something. They were so wrong.
But the PK had it pretty good, I thought. The PK seat tube, it might have been a small frame, but I always thought that the seat tube was pretty much right where it should have been.
Yep, and the slacker head angle and then a short back end, but I thought the front end was a little tight. But my problem was I grew like 8 inches from the time I was 14 till I was 15. So Torker sends me a EK, Eddie King. And man, I thought that was, I got a chromoly chrome bike, and I got a Torker. I thought that was just the bomb, And that was like my first shop, this is when stuff started to get serious in like 1979, 80 in Minnesota. And but I didn't realize that I'm riding this thing. I got a picture of me. I just posted, I think, on your Facebook 80s page. And if you look at it, you're like, man, that guy's way too tall for that bike, And so later in the season, it was really late in the season, Torker finally sent me a full pro frame because I just grew fast, and all of a sudden I'm on a stiff bike with a long front end, and oh my God, like I was on fire that fall. Everything I touched was just because all of a sudden you're on the right bike, you don't know any better. you know, like, oh, that's the bike I should be riding. You don't know that Eddie King is 5'6", 5'7", whatever his height is. You know, like I'm six
Right.
feet tall. So here I'm, you know, all crunched in on this little bike. And so I think that's a really interesting conversation about this evolution of geometry. I think about it a lot. I designed bikes back then, but what I notice now is that I should have been on a Patterson or a Panda. Like I should have just looked at other tall guys and said, "This is going to be a." You know, the reason I got that Torker was because they had the guy from Florida, Roland Voigt. He's 6'2" or 6'3", so they made him a long frame, and all of a sudden, I'm like, "Well, this feels great," you know.
Right.
So
I always this always perplexed me. Maybe you could shed some light on it. Let's take Redline for instance. Redline, the square back, I always thought that was a pretty close to perfect seat tube angle for the time, right? For the mid 70s. I always thought it was pretty good. But then they go off with this Pro line, this MX2 with the seat tube way back and the head tube all kicked out. Is this something that they just sit around and say, we need to make a change to market the bike? Or does it come from a rider? Does a rider say, hey, I want them seat tube farther back? I mean, because I think this is way before Stu got on the team. Who makes these decisions? Like, let's fuck up a perfectly good design and kick the seat tube way back.
I can't answer that specifically, but I do. You know, it's clearly like I think when you get a rider working with the team, and you know, I don't know. I think about like the whole Pro Series frame of everything, not just them, but Pro GT, Pro Hutch, like all this stuff. I kind of wonder who was riding it and what was the feedback they were given, and were they listening to it, or to your point, were they just sort of trying to anticipate the market or do something a little different? Because fairly ubiquitous design. I mean, you're just talking about half an inch here or there, or a couple degrees here or there. And the question being, did anybody really do development? You know, and I don't think really anybody. I think Patterson. I was just looking at some stuff from Patterson and what they were doing, and I think because both the guys were 6'1", 6'2", they did give direct feedback, and you know, and their dad was working with, you know, right directly with a fabricator. I think that's why the Pattersons were good for tall guys. And you look at that geometry. I mean, the Huffies that all the guys were riding, you know, when Huffy came along, Stu and Gary and all these guys, they look like Pattersons, you know, even the ringed headsets, you know, like, hey, because I cracked my first GT, you know, the ringed headset actually works, you know. So I think when we were working close, I mean, look how gimmicky stuff got, right? Like when I was 15, 1980, I won the state championships, and my motivation was that I've been contacted by TW Racing. You know, Denny Davido's, you know, on TW, right? You look at that frame, you're like, oh man, that double down tube's really cool, and then, you know, the long story or the short story of that whole thing is that Denny gets out there, he gets a photo, he got, you know, TW starts cranking up, and I can't remember what his name was, Roger or something, but he had somebody make some frames, but you had to do something different looking, right? Yeah. And that double down tube was pretty cool. Yeah. You know, well, the problem was, you know, Pete Lonkarevich was on TW for a bit there too, right? Or when he got off, was he off a Diamondback? But yeah. But the problem is the frames just started cracking and breaking, and, you know, pretty soon Roger was broke.